Welcome to the latest episode of CISO Point of View. I'm really excited to be joined by Ashish Thapar from NTT Security. Ashish is the VP Consulting Services for Asia Pacific. Ashish, how are you doing today?
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much, Doron, for inviting me to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to have you with us. So before we dive into the questions, Ashish, spend a few minutes telling us a bit about who you are and where you came from.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Doron. So I think before I talk about myself, I think it's a very interesting topic that you've picked up in terms of maybe to an extent what keeps the CISOs awake at night. I think I'm very happy to kind of share some of my thoughts on this important topic which I think CISOs wrestle with on an everyday basis. Personally, I believe that, when I think of CISOs, I compare them not with a border security commander. I actually look at them as a homeland security chief because I think their threats are not only just coming from to be honest, there is no perimeter nowadays, right? So there's no border to protect. There is insider threats. You have external adversaries that are colluding with insiders. You have, you need to have on-ground optics. You need latest weapons. You need to be careful not to kill innocent civilians, right? Also known as legit IT processes and business functions and network traffic, manage sleeper cells, right? Trojans of sorts. So I think this is a very, very, very tough job, and very happy to speak with you on what CISOs are really wrestle with. Just about myself. So I did my education in a very different field, right? I did my chemistry honors, as I used to love chemistry back then and how it can really make a big difference to the day-to-day lives. But during my graduation, I had a sort of exposure to computing on programming, like, I don't know, maybe folks may even recall BASIC and GW Basic way back, right? And maybe if it sounds too old for my age then, but that was like my first love with IT, and it didn't stop there. I continued. I did my master's in computer application, which is a three-year full-time course, and then I went into security operations role, went on to different companies in managed security services, and for last 15 plus years in consulting. And today I'm managing all security consulting practices for NTT Security as a vice president.
Fantastic. Sounds like you got a busy job on your hands.
Indeed.
All right. So we are deep into 2021. It's been a hell of a year so far. Where do you see things going for the remainder of the year? What are your predictions?
Oh, okay. Crystal ball gazing. Okay. Let me try my best. So I think this is a tough one, right? So based on what we are seeing, and in fact, NTT also released its Global Threat Intelligence report, and there are some interesting observations that we have gathered from that report based on which industries are being targeted, in terms of finance, manufacturing, and healthcare. And rightfully so, if you see from a finance perspective, that's where the money is. Historically, they have been attacked most of the time. But manufacturing coming right on top three here is a very interesting one, primarily because of intellectual property. And then in terms of the key research and innovation that is going on in that sector, they are absolutely being targeted. And then healthcare for obvious reasons, from a COVID-19 research perspective and all the geopolitical climate that goes around in terms of one-upmanship. If you ask me about my predictions, from a personal perspective, I can say that I believe ransomware will become a mainstream event, and not just because of the disruption it creates, but actually, which we have already started seeing in terms of how it is actually leading to things like data disclosure, data breaches, and cyber extortion of sorts. On a personal front, I would also be expecting a lot of doxing happening in near future, where individuals could be actually put to cyber extortion. Operational technology, industrial control systems would be massively attacked. I think that's where the criminals are trying to really get in. The adversaries are trying to get in, knowing that it has always been a head in the sand approach in terms of those areas. Everybody thought these were air-gapped networks. I think that notion is completely broken because of automation and all the benefits that come along with connecting things. There is an increased threat landscape on that side. I also believe, which is also a finding from the NTT Global Threat Intelligence Report, is about privacy and data breach notification and regulations being more stringent, emerging in more countries, and more compliance requirements coming out of that. Cloud security is another one which is really going to be massively become a focus because cloud attacks will increase, and because that's where everybody is, right? Every workload in COVID-19 has moved to cloud, so we will see more attacks there. And last but not the least, I think the current pandemic will continue to embolden the threat groups, given the hybrid workforce, remote working environment, and things related to that, and especially in the VUCA world that we live in, right? We call it volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So that's what my take is.
Yeah, and you mentioned the NTT Global Threat Intelligence Report. This is an annual tradition. And one of the most important pieces of research and insight into the industry. And I'd encourage all our viewers to go and check it out on the website, NTT website. There's some fantastic insight in that research. Okay, so based on your role of working with many CISOs, many security teams across different industries, you touched on financial services, manufacturing. From your experience, what measures should organizations be taking to prepare for the next ransomware event that perhaps they're not doing today?
Okay, I think this is an interesting one. Actually, the level of preparedness on ransomware-related events varies from a sector to sector. Some sectors are mature enough because of regulatory pushes, and obviously, historically, they have been mature, for example, financial services, but other sectors haven't really thought through that. Everybody in the past used to have that notion of, we don't have confidential data, so we don't need to have security. But, knock, knock, here you have ransomware, which is not really impacting confidentiality. Well, now it is in last few months, but historically it was impacting availability. So I think in the current form, the organization really need to do much more than what they are doing. Specifically, I would talk about important perspectives of robust backup management, disaster recovery practices. In fact, there was a very important control that was mentioned by somebody, from Europe or UK in specific. I think some senior person in the central security agency there, talking about the importance of even printing the call tree and keeping printouts of when things go sideways, when snow hits the fan, what do you do? If everything is encrypted, who would you call? That very simple stuff, right? Even simple stuff like that. Last but not the least, I would definitely say ransomware, end of the day, is a malware. The very fact that that malware entered in your network, beating down through your layers of defenses, I think that really is a wake-up call for organizations to really. I always really love the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? I think from a 5 functions perspective, the focus areas from identify, detect, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. I think if you really need to protect your infrastructure and your data well, I think you need to invest a lot in these areas, and more importantly so on response, because gone is that notion of we need to keep the bad guys out. I think the notion today is we need to make sure that the bad guys do not meet their end objectives, because they will get in this way or the other.
Yeah, it's a change of mindset, right? Yeah. Okay. And in your opinion, what are the biggest security known unknowns? Okay.
Well, that's an interesting one. So I think the biggest security known unknowns, and again, working through a lot of customers that I work for in different sectors, in different geographies across Asia Pacific, what I've discovered is things like shadow IT. I think this is one of the big, it's a big known unknown, because I think this is something as a concept, as an outlier that exists in organizations. They haven't done much to really strengthen it, and goes back to the governance and compliance requirements. So that's one. Second is the third-party risk. I think the SolarWinds incident has really shaken the world upside down in terms of how the importance of third-party security and supply chain risk can really bring down organizations. Like, I would give you a few examples, right? If you remember, there was a big RSA token ID breach many years back. That was possibly one of the first supply chain risks that actually unleashed. But I think the industry didn't wake up with that, right? This was, I think, some of the biggest defense contractors got compromised through that breach. And here you have solar winds repeating itself. So I think the key point is you need to have that mindset of zero trust to drive security controls across your infrastructure. You need to have secure by design approach so that you can really, kind of limit the exposure in across different layers. You need to have different levels of protection and different layers of protection. So supply chain risk is particular, third party risk, like I mentioned, are important, known unknowns, big ones, and risk from open source software. It's a very easy nowadays. A lot of developers, being DevOps and agile development, they are reusing a lot of code, and at times they are using a lot of a repository from GitHub and all the public code available open source. I don't know if organizations, before they include those open source code in their or libraries in their infrastructure or software components, are they really being watchful? Are they checking them statically and dynamically in runtime to see if there is anything bad happening there? You can't just trust, and that is again the I'm sorry to be a broken record here. Zero trust is a way of life. You have to really challenge each and every component, identity, device, user in your network before you really open up. And the biggest one, last but not the least, is insider threats, right? Isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, that's starting to make headlines big time.
Indeed.
All right. So again, based on your experience of working with multiple clients, do organizations and primarily large enterprises, do they have a good grasp of where their crown jewels are, where they reside and where they're located?
Okay. Well, this one is an easy answer, and it's not a good answer to really share. We do a lot of breach investigations, and we work with a lot of customers to understand their maturity, cybersecurity maturity. In fact, there is a cybersecurity advisory platform that we utilize to gauge customer maturity levels from a current state to a target state and take them through a journey. I can tell you, and I back to the NIST CSF, right? The identify stage. I can tell you that is possibly the most important stage, if you can really ask me, to really make sure that you have a very strong foundation of knowing what you have, whether it is about information, whether it is about assets, whether it is about devices. And from a crown jewels perspective, again, I think this is again something which possibly varies from industry sector to industry sector. Again, sectors that are very heavily regulated have become more mature, because they have gone through the grind for a longer period of time. So that's that. So those sectors are possibly definitely aware of those, but I think those that are not are possibly keeping, they don't even have crown jewels. So let's say, for example, an Active Directory domain controller in an organization. Well, that could be a crown jewel. Let's say you have a research file server where you actually keep a lot of research and intellectual property data. Well, that could be a crown jewel. So I think it goes back to the point of conducting a boring risk assessment, and I may be sounding very boring here, but I can tell you that risk assessment, that importance of identifying your critical assets, understanding the threat and vulnerabilities and probability of threat occurrence, and making sure that you do conduct risk assessment methodically is important. So I think I would say sector by sector varies, and that's why when you see non-financial services industries coming into the top 3, as I mentioned in our GTIR, as top industries being attacked, well, that's where the answer lies, that a lot needs to be done.
Yeah, I want to touch on one of your points. So you mentioned identifying your critical assets. Obviously, that's the basics. One of the things that we've seen in the past, probably 12 months or so, is the increased sophistication of ransomware attacks. And if attackers really want to do damage to a bank or even a manufacturing company or any industry, if they want to cause damage, they're going to try to get to that critical data. And in many cases, that data resides in the core central storage systems. What are your thoughts on the need to scale vulnerability management or security strategies from your endpoints, the OS, the networks, to the storage systems? Is that something that's come up recently?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point, and I'm a big believer of not driving security to protect data center, but actually drive security in a data-centric manner, right? So have data-centric security rather than data center security. So I think your question is very, very pertinent. Well, some of the things that I've seen organizations do is, again, back to the point, right? Before an adversary really comes into your environment, into your bedroom and trying to attack you in your house, in your home, you need to have levels and layers of security controls, right? So I think robust anti-malware controls play a very important role. Encryption plays a very important role. So, one is about availability of data. Second is about confidentiality. So let's say if the data gets lost, if it is encrypted and there is strong encryption, again, encryption is not a bliss, right? You need to make sure that your algorithms are strong and your keys are managed properly. So encryption is one of the things. Data-centric security concept, driving security to the data itself and making sure that, back to your point about identifying your critical information assets, not just hardware, but information assets is critical. Offsite and offline backups obviously go a long way. And then, of course, cloud-based, right? I mean, what you mentioned about data, and you talk about unprotected storage buckets and the kind of, chaos that happens if you don't really put a lot of attention there is absolutely unimaginable. So I think a bunch of controls there that organizations can do to protect their data. End of the day, it's all about making sure that right from the inception of an application, you embed security by design, so that when you are even collecting data, I mean, one is about data security, right? And second is about data privacy, data protection. And today you have to be very, very mindful of anytime you are storing any data of your consumers or customers, you have to think 10 times, do we really need it? And if we do, then what controls we put in place?
Yeah, I'd like to move the conversation on to talk about roles and responsibilities. You have the security teams, you have the IT departments. In many cases, in many companies, they'll sit in different departments. Do you think there's a close alignment between your security teams and your, let's say, your infrastructure and operations team? Is there a happy marriage there? Or do you think there's work that needs to be done to bridge the gap?
Yeah, okay, interesting question again. So I think I'm married, and I can tell you, right, happy marriage at times is an ideal state, and it may not exist everywhere. But I can tell you that there is always a gap that may exist, because sometimes it's not by design. It's just because priorities are misaligned. These departments have different priorities, so because of that misalignment, at times these gaps do exist. I would even add, along with the infrastructure teams you mentioned, teams like DevOps, right? Again, very different priority, right? Speed, execution, delivery, that's their priority. Security is not their priority. So you need to enhance, you really need to have that happy marriage of sorts that you mentioned, where you need to shift left, in terms of making sure that you embed security in an early stage conversation, not at a late stage conversation. Because if you do it, later, it's an exponential expense. It's too painful. It's too much of friction. And something I think a lot of organizations talk about, shift left strategy, but it's often talked about but seldom executed. And like I said, right, zero trust architecture approach again goes a long way to making sure that you move away from network-based filtering controls to shift the authentication, authorization controls towards identities, users, and devices or even applications. Yeah.
Great. What are your thoughts or perhaps recommendations for CISOs? Let's say a CISO is starting a new position, or they're revisiting their strategy. Do you have any particular recommendations specifically on the importance of building a mature, advanced strategy from the ground up?
So, Duran, again, this is important, right? Because like I said, right, CISO's job, I said in the start, CISO's job is not an easy job at all. It's a very hot seat. Everything goes fine. They're all happy. Anything goes wrong, there you go, right? So I think what we really recommend when we work with CISOs, and I enjoy a very good relationship with a lot of friends who are CISOs. I think one of the things that you really need to bring to the fore is measurement. Because when you cannot measure something, you cannot showcase where you are, and then you cannot really measure the outcomes, and then you cannot show the improvements. So establish a baseline, measure security outcomes. Some of the other tips or recommendations that I would give to CISOs is use security visibility or indicators, both from an outside in perspective and then from inside out perspective, right? So make sure that you gather your security posture coverage from a 360-degree view, right? A 360-degree appraisal, it's season of appraisals actually in our company. And then try to quantify the cyber risk. Try to speak the language that the board can understand. Try to quantify it, because I think that's another thing, right? Models like FAIR, right, which is a factor of information risk, right? From that perspective, you need to have that quantification of risk where you can really showcase, okay, it really leads to these many dollars of value if we really don't address this problem. Make sure that you involve senior management in your, at least on a monthly basis, if not more, so that they are aware of the risks. I mean, everybody reads newspaper, right? Isn't it? Everybody read about the Colonial Pipeline issue and how it kind of, the waves it created and the embarrassment it created. So I think and the last thing I would say is make sure you try to arrive at a model where you can really articulate, if you invest X dollars, you can help diminish the risk by Y percentage. Unless you get to that level, I can tell you board level conversations are very difficult. And that goes to the point of cybersecurity investment prioritization, right? You need to get money on the table to make sure that organization is protected, and security becomes a business enabler, not a business disruptor.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think it's great advice for security teams. And one final question, and it's aligned to the previous question. If there's one recommendation, and I'm only limiting it to one recommendation you have for CISOs to really get a bigger seat at that table, right? And you touched on it already when it comes to showcasing ROI and being able to justify the investment, talking the same language. Would you summarize it in any other way? Is there one other recommendation you have, or you think you more or less covered everything?
No, I think I actually, maybe something that I forgot to mention, which actually can really bring everything to life in front of senior board members, is to conduct a tabletop exercise. Get them involved, get them in a room, take them through that panic room situation. I can tell you it can bring dividends, not only in terms of your security investment, but actually making sure that the board gives you all the eyes and ears that you really need for you to get investment and get their attention and get their blessing and sponsorship. So there you go.
Fantastic. Ashish, that's been amazing. It's been really, really insightful. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. Pleasure is entirely mine, Daron. Thanks for having me here. Thank you.